And how about the conference itself? What have you thought of the other talks that you've seen and the people that you've been able to meet here today?
It's been great, right? I mean, everyone's been very interactive. Lots of people coming up and asking us questions, but not only that, we've learned a lot as well. You know, you always learn from others. There's always something you can learn no matter who you're talking to. And it's great to be able to share our experiences with others so hopefully they take something away that they can learn.
Yeah, it was great to hear John's keynote presentation and to see the face behind the Phoenix Project book, a really great read, and meeting other people from different industries who are solving problems in similar ways. Really interesting.
It's really cool. All right, thanks guys. We'll enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Nathan.
All right.
True story. I did let him off the hook beforehand because it was just going to get ridiculous. And besides, this is time to share with you guys, not hear from Nathan. We've heard from him this morning and it was fantastic. I've got a true story to tell you. It's a story of a tale of two cities. There was the good part and then there was the bad part. So if you don't mind, we'll probably start with the bad part first. But a little bit about who is actually sponsoring this talk other than your good selves for paying for this ticket and being here at the conference. Healthdirect, the company, is funded by you. So we are paid by taxpayers to provide consumers with information about health services, to get you the information you need to make your own decisions around your own health, and to avoid you going to emergency or to a doctor unless you really need to. Because I don't know if you've been to an emergency department lately, but if you really don't need to be there, you don't want to be there. A, it's expensive, and frankly, you're probably likely to catch something from the person next to you that you really didn't want to know about or have to ever Google that term ever again. On the bottom left-hand corner, we do a bunch of things. The one on the bottom left happens to be what I'm responsible for, which is a directory of all the health services, and it's information infrastructure that we bolt into the different health jurisdictions and allow people to refer patients between providers and those sort of things. You are at the heart of what we do is the slogan, but it's actually what motivates people to come and work for us, because we all have families and we've all actually used the services that we're a part of delivering. For those of you who haven't, I'll do the usual pitch, but there is a mobile app. You've paid for it. You should have it on your phone. It'll help you find information about health services, and it'll give you some guidance about what to do around your symptoms as well. And this is me. This isn't a good story. This is one of the bad parts. But before we unpack how I got to this point, I want to tell you a little bit around one key concept, two stories about that concept, the time I got it wrong, and the time I got it right as a leader in my role. And then there's 12 months until your next promotion is what I'm selling you here today, which is why you're still here, which is why you're listening. And so I'm going to help tie that up for you and make it easy for you to transition into that next role, that next opportunity. And lastly, because this is a service that is provided essentially by Healthdirect as this presentation, technically your taxpayer dollars are funding the next 30 minutes of your own life and of my contribution to you, which means there is a calculation somewhere about how many cents I owe you if this didn't work out for you. So I'm happy to give you that money back. Or more importantly, if you'd like to catch up with me for a coffee, I'll buy the coffee and let's talk about what you'd like to see next time. So this is going to get a bit real. I hope you don't mind if it's a little bit awkward, if it's a little bit social interactory. I'm going to have to get you to introduce yourself to a person next to you, which means the whole, meet space interaction, talking to someone and getting to know them. You're going to have about 30 seconds, and to do this, we really need to stand up because there's something happens next after this slide which involves moving, which is going to be really awkward if you're sitting down. So I'm going to have to ask you to go and stand up and find a person that you can talk to, and you've got 30 seconds to share your names. Go for it. All right, preferably just names. As a hint, in case you can't remember your own name, it's on a label on your test. It should be quite easy to locate. Most of us should be able to parse that label. And all right. And now you're about to discover why you had to know someone's name. Are you intrigued? All right, let's go. Ladies and gentlemen, you're about to discover why you had to introduce yourself to the person next to you, and I hope this is going to be as awkward as I intended it to be. You're about to learn how to practice abstraction, but not in a technical context. This is abstraction in a human context. So I'm going to give you 20 seconds, and you are to describe, one of you will describe a famous place using 10 words or less, but you cannot use the place name. The other person has to guess what that is, and then when they guess it, you can stop. You've got 20 seconds. Your time starts now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Hands up, everyone who actually was able to guess what they were talking about. All right, keep those hands up. Keep those hands up. Who actually guessed what it was they were talking about? And everyone who used the harbour bridge as the example, keep your hands up. You lazy so-and-so. This is like the easiest one. Okay. This gets a bit harder, so I'm really sorry for the person who didn't go first because you really wish you would have now. Your job as the second person is now to demonstrate a famous place. No words, and I can hear you because no one's talking. So no words, and you've got 20 seconds to demonstrate a famous place, and they've got to guess it. Your time starts now. Go. Six, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Okay, I hope that was a little bit harder. Odds are it was a bit harder. Hands up who actually guessed what they were talking about. All right, keep those hands up, anyone who guessed what they were talking about. And keep them up if it was the Eiffel Tower. Everyone goes. It is so obvious. All right, grab a seat. Thank you very much for entertaining yourselves and me. Let's talk about abstraction. The process that you just went through is to essentially take what is actually a relatively complicated concept. You have to uniquely identify a thing, describe it, and yet you have to boil it down to its most essential characteristics. And that's not something that's new to us. We do it in the technology realm, but we do it as humans incessantly. In every place we go, we often have to describe something complicated in terms that's appropriate for an audience and get a message across. For example, on the left-hand side here, you see a collection of shapes. On their own, those shapes mean nothing. Clearly what it is, though, is kale pizza with some hipster cheese, and that's all what you came to the conclusion of, right? Or perhaps maybe you landed somewhere here. And that's more likely to be the case. And it's quite extraordinary that the picture on the left is where the majority of us in the audience would have landed, given that that thing on the right is actually what we're trying to communicate about. In technology, we live with abstraction every single day. In fact, if you stop and consider the levels of abstraction that we put in the technology stack, and you begin to unpack those and the complexity that exists in every single layer of abstraction, and how we manage that, and how we actually manage coming to work and not just freaking out every day, knowing that there's an insane amount of detail that has to go end to end for the services that we own to work, is quite extraordinary. Just a quick hands up, over the last, say, this calendar year, how many people in the room have actually touched a server running in a rack? Check it out. These people do real IT still, all right. So for 15 years of my career, that was my job. Or that was what we delivered as part of that service. That wasn't an abstraction. That was a fundamental responsibility of the teams that we built and operated, and that was the service that we provided in our organization. And as you can see today, almost maybe 80% of the room, if not 75%, being conservative, haven't touched that in this calendar year. That's 8 months. That's extraordinary. If you go back as recently as 5 years, almost everyone in the room would have put their hands up and said, yeah, that's us. We still do that. It's one of those computer room things. We abstract that. We've now got hypervisors that we manage. And odds are more of us in the room would be responsible for some of the hypervisor responsibilities, or maybe infrastructure as a service operators that begin to build these and offer them as products. And frankly, there's APIs on front of those. So even those have abstractions which simplify some of the concepts and some of the capabilities by introducing a layer that translates what you're intending to do with what they do in the background. On top of this, you then have some sort of operating system concept that you're building and delivering, and then you have your orchestration layer for state and for coordinating a fleet of these things. And then you've got another set of APIs that orchestrates the orchestrator, which orchestrates the operating system, which is orchestrating potentially the infrastructure underneath it to perform things for you. You can see where this is going. And this is the world that we, as people responsible for infrastructure services or DevOps or infrastructure development or the whole stack experience, have been a part of for a very long time. And it's still a core part of our responsibilities. We've heard a lot of talks the last 2 days around people who live and breathe this stuff. And it's an interesting concept to consider how much of us don't touch physical hardware still. And that's still at the bottom of this abstraction stack that we're talking about. And yet we're still responsible for the stuff toward the right-hand side. My argument's going to be that over time, we tend to be focusing more and more and more on the abstraction of those services and less on the actual having to manage the detail. And those detailed characteristics and complexities are beginning to be taken care of for us by as-a-service providers. So when it comes to our skill sets, we're constantly running to keep up. We're sprinting fast to make sure that what we're capable of doing is still relevant because another company is catching up and going to rent that to our CFO or CIO with a credit card. What doesn't tend to be abstracted so readily, though, is what happens on top of this stack. So when it comes to our applications, we have some sort of state layer. We've got static contents on a bucket. We've got relational databases. We have this concept of an eventually consistent magical database, which when it breaks, you just run away because you don't understand how it really works, called Mongo. Then you have other things like your core APIs. These begin to abstract how you access and manage changes to state. But you don't ever want to allow people like your developers who do the front-end thing to dip straight into your state because you just don't trust them or you don't trust that the system won't fall over itself. So you introduce another abstraction layer called your core APIs. And then you've got your presentation layer concerns, yet another abstraction on top of this abstraction of abstraction of abstraction. And these typically deal with, these are the functional components that we're going to expose to people. But if you were going to present this as a product in an application to your mum, I don't think it's going to go down so well because she's still struggling to understand how to use a laptop, let alone maybe SOAP UI. Then you get to the UI, right? You get to the thing that you've actually built that you're going to hand to someone that's the first test of, are we any good and do you like us and do you want to keep using us and giving us money? This is where the rubber hits the road. And to have gotten to this point, you have to have dealt with all the abstractions that exist underneath this to deliver a service to the people that ultimately are using your services that your company is employing you to provide to them. And it's really interesting for us, I think, as technology leaders and as technology experts, to step back from this abstraction stack and go, well, where do I focus and spend my time? And is that focus and is that time aligned with the people on the far right-hand side who are actually the ones going to, at the end of the day, make a decision about whether this is valuable or whether this was something they were happy to continue to pay to use? So my question is, or one of the questions I've got is, can abstraction lead to distraction? And I'll let you read this for a second. It's a classic XKCD. You see, I used to use this example, this slide, as an example for how siloing can help you focus on functional excellence in your particular discipline and technical domain and miss the context of what's going on around you. But I have a different opinion now, and I think that you can't actually judge what's going on here accurately because you lack context. You don't know whether there's 4,000 people also for asking for salt in other rooms. Therefore, it might have been a fantastic investment to spend 20 minutes building a system that can pump out salt dispensers because you've got 4,000 happy customers and you just made one happen to wait for 20 minutes. And it's that lack of context because this is that whole context is abstracted. It's kind of implied there's one customer and frankly, it'd suck if you're that guy waiting for his breakfast that's gone cold. However, you really don't know from the information provided. So when abstracting work, I like to consider this as potentially part of the way you would approach an API design. And with an API design, you have a contract at the interface. And you agree that these are the capabilities that I'm going to expose. You even imply that there's a guarantee of some sort of response rate or an information format or structure that you can depend on when you bind to this API. So why don't we consider the work that we do in a similar manner? Because the benefit of abstracting the API's functionality internally at the interface means that you can do whatever you want as a developer as long as you satisfy the interface contract. As long as you can scale as necessary, as long as you can continue to provide the service that is depended upon by the consumers of that API. It doesn't matter what you do to do that, in theory, as long as you deliver on what's at the contract. And allows you to focus on the work that really matters. Without those interface sort of contracts, if we are doing work, then there's actually a risk of us becoming faster and better, but potentially a bit stupid, because the people who are depending on the things that we provide might not have gotten value from the work that we're doing. Which brings us back to my story. About 2 years ago, we embarked on, 2.5 years ago actually, a technology project that was cutting edge. It involved whales and there was ships with containers on fire, and you know where we're going with this probably. It was bleeding edge when it came to enterprise. It was definitely bleeding edge when it came to security and some of the challenges therein, but we needed to solve a real organizational problem, which was one of speed to delivery. You see, Healthdirect as a company, our most important channel is the digital one. It scales, in theory, infinitely. And the work that we do has to make sure it's always available, always on time, And that scale, we're seeing it lift off at almost 2 or 3 times the growth rate per annum than we've seen in the past. So we had to pivot toward being able to provide that sort of speed as infrastructure underneath those services. The solution we thought was going to be containers. At the time, that made perfect sense. It was a new domain, and we embarked upon this project knowing that we would be able to ship some great results and solve some business problems. And within 3 months, we realized we had a lot more work to do because the depth and complexity of the challenges in that space weren't abstracted for us. We had to deal with it right back to the root level of how are we going to solve for container security, how are we going to solve for integrity of the container from a registry right through to production and hosting that, how are we going to cluster this thing, how are we going to schedule deployment and redeployment, how are we going to know when we need to, how are we going to know if it's operationally mature, what are we going to do about logging, and we've seen some great talks on that today. But two years ago, there were no talks. 2.5 years ago, half the people I worked with didn't know what Docker was. So that was a real interesting position for us. But we dived in headlong. And then 6 months later, we landed here when we realized that as an organization, we had, as a technical organization, and at the time I was responsible for infrastructure operations and the platform concern, we had lost sight because of the need to get this technology right. We'd lost sight of the value that we were actually hired to provide to the organization. And so our abstracted concern, our abstracted responsibility to the company was a fast and a resilient and a secure platform to deliver digital services on top of that health consumers can depend on. And we had to make sure it was in that state before we could provide it. And because we were chasing this long tail of complexity and immaturity in some of this, the technology stack, the opportunity cost to the organization became unacceptable, and we had to call it quits. Unfortunately, for me as the leader, that was my responsibility to have let it get to that point. 6 months of work before we realized this was not on track. We should have made that decision about 2 months in. So how do you avoid getting to those positions? There's a lot of soul searching involved, as you would expect, from someone who had to acknowledge that we did not make the right call. And I think to the defense of everyone involved, the only way you can assess that is you look back and say, given what you achieved, would you do it, and would you still say it was worth doing, or would you say it was wrong to do? And I think in hindsight, we can say it was wrong to do because of the outcome. Not so straightforward to see. That's a benefit of hindsight discussion. The other way we look at these things now is that we don't see technology as the reason that we're hired. So when we hire people into the teams that work for us, we tell them about the services we provide and how the work they do connects to those services. Because the odds are that the reason you're hired or the reason that you hire people is not for technology. It's actually because someone or the person that hired you or the business that employs you believes that you can make a real difference to the services that your customer provides to your customer, that your company provides to your customers. So there's people on the far right-hand side of that abstraction layer are the ultimate end game. And that's the capital A abstraction for us, is to stay focused on them and to make sure that we don't allow ourselves to become even somewhat enamored by new technology and trends that are coming up if it distracts us from providing a better service at the end of the day to a customer. You see, we also learned from our review of how we went that our work can frankly be hazardous, and that building brilliant technology outcomes does not always equal what we should consider a DevOps outcome. And that's something that's there to drive fantastic learning, fantastic quick delivery of services, and great value to customers. Not necessarily the technology that gets you there, although that's an enormous enabler and an enormous change agent for us as technologists to make it happen. So I would just ask that we beware of our focus, because when I took my eye off the ball, we ended up making a 6-month mistake that cost the business time and cost the opportunity cost of my team's investment elsewhere. We've now pivoted completely to serverless for our new generation architecture, by the way, and none of that requires containers to run the applications in. In fact, we've got one core services layer running a Spring Boot on EC2, and that's really it. The rest of it's serverless architecture. So that's how fast things have changed. So given that was only 2 years ago that we called quits, it's extraordinary how short the lifespan and ultimately your return on investment calculations should be based around very, very short timeframes given the rapid maturity of the service providers in this space. So one way to avoid this is for leaders to consider ourselves as designers, but not just of tech. It's often that from a technology track that will come through our discipline, we'll get into some sort of influencing opportunity where we own more of the problem, we see more of the opportunity to solve it, and we have influence over what the technology looks like and how you design it. So you become a designer. It's either an architect by title or it's a responsibility by just the way you work and who you influence. But what about people? What if we approached our people design the way we consider an API design? where we have a contract and an interface and a declaration of what is to be expected and how it's to be delivered. And this concept we applied to some of the restructures that we then subsequently did as an organisation to solve things like dependence on centralised groups who were at the time, we had the Devops team, right, that pattern. And we've completely restructured that away. So we now have multidisciplinary teams who can deliver the entire product and service without breaking outside of that team boundary. They still have interdependencies though, so let's look at how that works for us. In the most simple example of this model, you have a team of people delivering to a customer. And that's awesome because you know them, you probably identify them with them by name potentially if you're lucky. You can have them come in and talk to you and you can see, smell, touch, feel whether the products you're delivering are any good because you're going to hear about it straight away. And it's a straightforward value equation between you got money, you delivered a service, they keep giving you money or they stop. It gets a little bit more complicated as you have other teams in your organizations that you're inevitably going to be dependent upon. And this is where we began to introduce the concept of the API or the interface between the team and beginning to define our obligations that we would make of each other as essentially contracts. And we begin to build up our people architecture. And it gets a little bit more interesting as you have interdependencies and multiple customer groups that you're looking at. This is probably the part where most organizations sit. And the challenge for the service team, or often what would be a technology or a platform team, or I'll add last here at the top, is they often don't have a direct company customer interface. They have internal customer interfaces that you can bind your obligations and responsibilities to. But it's often hard to look, see, touch, feel the customer and then measure your value from that perspective. But if you were to draw your people architecture and your company architecture somewhat similar to this, you would be able to have traceability between the service that you provide, the obligations that you're under from those who depend on them, and how those services are related to the service that your company provides or that other group provides to your customer. And I'd challenge you to go and draw this up when you get back to your teams, to go and figure out, okay, where do we get value and who judges that value? Does it come from a customer? Does it come from an external perspective of someone who uses my products and services? The person that you described, like I did when I stood up, I work for you, you use our services. I don't talk about maybe the legal team who uses some of my advice or the other teams internally who might use one of my services as part of their website. I talk about you, the end user. And that's an abstraction for me because often the consumer value of my own product sits behind somebody else's website or mobile app. So there are some benefits with this approach. And this is one that I'd like to show you a good story about. And I'll wrap at that point. You see, when you approach team design as you would potentially an API, you can then look at it using unique or explicit declarations of purpose, responsibility, dependencies, accountability measures, and authorities is where that gets really interesting. When you begin to document these things for a team of people, what it creates is a zone that they have an explicit responsibility for. They begin to have definitions around what they're there to do, and by implicit definition, what they're not responsible for. The important part for me, though, is that last statement at the bottom of the screen there. None of these things should tell them how to do their job. That's a really critical point, and it makes all the difference for us in our organisation and drives some of the innovative thinking and some of the performance improvement that we've seen. But they should bind them as an obligation to the delivery of that service and the performance of it. So what does this look like in practice? Well, one of my teams in the National Health Services Directory is responsible for data management. And that's a great name for a very unsexy part of what some of their job is, which is to go and validate content in a directory of all the health service providers in the country. An example would be, if I have no other way of validating it, I have people who will make a phone call to your general practice and say, hey, Sandra here from the National Health Services Directory. Yes, the one funded by the government. No, I don't need money. Please don't hang up, please don't hang up, please don't hang up. I would just like to check, do you still have wheelchair access? Great, thanks, bye. Database entry done. And that's a pretty painful process. It's our option of last resort, but because we have to make sure the data is complete and validated regularly, we'll have to go to those lengths sometimes. That was a team that, as you can imagine, wouldn't necessarily see their work as particularly engaging or exciting, right? That's not the sort of thing you wake up and go, I'm going to work in essentially an outbound contact center who's validating data. So we wanted to reframe their work because there was an opportunity here to see a dramatic improvement to the quality of the service. And we started by connecting them with who they were providing the service to. And it was an abstraction, but it was to you. And you as a health consumer, as I, actually look up the content that we provide around about 800,000 times per month. Typically, it's surfaced via organic search results in Google pages or the like, or on websites across the different health jurisdictions and government agencies in the country or mobile apps. But if you're finding a service and you're looking for a GP, odds are that data was either validated or provided by the National Health Services Directory. So we started telling them stories and getting them engaged with their customer and getting that identity thing going. We then gave them responsibility for the value abstraction, but not for the activity. I'll come back to that. The abstracted responsibility they have is data quality. It's not to manage data. It's actually to improve the quality of the data so it's appropriate for the use. And then we just made performance visible. And that's it. And then I left them alone. There was a middle management change, and that person used to give them a lot of instruction. We came back a month later and things had gone downhill. That's because they weren't used to having to make their own decisions or figure out what to do to solve the problem. A month later, they realized, hang on, this is real. We're going to get measured every month, and they're not going to tell us what to do. And they're refusing to tell us what to do, and we've got to figure out what to do ourselves. And then a month later, we saw some really cool stuff. A year later, what we began to see was the team improving their own technology, their own processes, their own tools, because they remained accountable to the value delivery and the abstracted value that they were actually there to deliver. They weren't being told what to do for process. They weren't being told how to go and do a certain thing. Sure, there were policies, and you can believe there are a lot of policies, but they were the ones actually asking for policies to be reviewed so that they can be more appropriate in their advice and their decision making, which is the first time I've ever heard a team in my entire career ask me, can we please have a policy for this so that we can make it easier to do our job? So all of a sudden they're pulling in the stuff that normally a manager in that sort of role would push down and imply as sort of roadblocks, right? These guys are asking for it because they know they need it. The most interesting part of this whole story for me was these three inflection points in the improvement on their work, right? 6 months, they hit a plateau. That was November last year. There was only so much they could do with the tools, the processes, the way they worked. And so they refactored them. They came up with a proposition. And we've heard about David Marquet's Turn the Ship Around book yesterday. One of the guys mentioned it. I think it was from Westpac. And that, to me, was the only thing I had given them as direction. I said, well, what do you intend to do? And that was it. And then a month later, they came back and they'd fixed it. They came up with a new idea, a new process, and turned it around. And they keep hitting these ceilings. And there's natural performance ceilings because you end up with some sort of limiting factor, and that limiting factor can be your people constraint. It can be your technology or your process. But they're still chasing the dream of we can improve data quality, and they come back with new ideas. The latest one is down to a significant technology investment, which we're in the middle of making. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes. So how do we get to there? From a leader's perspective, we read a lot of books, and we did a lot of soul searching to get on how do we actually change the culture and how do we introduce autonomous ways of delivering work and thinking, and then to step back and hold them accountable for the value abstraction, and to step back and hold them not accountable for the way they did it, and not accountable for the tools they used, but ultimately for the actual service they provide to the organization. And this is a play straight out of agile/business agility and DevOps culture applied to a business team that has nothing to do with technology delivery. And it worked. And there's no surprise here, but people are people. And our motivating factors are often, like Dan Pink calls out in the Drive book, our ability to be masters of our domain, to have autonomy, and to have a reason to come to work and want to do this in the first place, so purpose. And we just introduce those structures around them to make the mastery, autonomy, purpose thing thrive. And it has exceptional results in every time I've applied this. If you're interested in doing some pretty gnarly stuff around corporate culture and you want to tackle it and you have influence, then I highly recommend you jump on these two particular communities. There's the Corporate Rebels and then there's the Ready. These are two groups who are deep into how do you transform organizations from the bottom up? How do you change culture to make it engaging and worth working for? And frankly, in the age of having to compete for people like you in this room when I'm doing hiring, I want to have the best possible answer for why my company is better to work for than the other ones I know that you're already talking to. And I think culture is going to be the ultimate differentiator of service performance and of a place that's worth working at. The promotion part. Hadn't forgotten about that. The promotion is straightforward, really. It's an abstraction benefit of these concepts when you apply them at your workplace. So I'd strongly encourage you, draw up why you work. Draw up what you need to be autonomous and to improve performance, and fight hard to get that. And then go and be accountable for delivery of improvement at that level of abstraction. Thank you all very much.